Welcome everyone to the final event for New South Wales Reads, a big book club to which the whole state has been invited. I hope you have a milkshake and a burger, maybe a mixed grill, or better still, a Greek feast to enjoy while you watch tonight. So sit back and relax. If you have a question for our author or a comment on your experience of reading the book, then please add it to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and we'll get to audience questions at the end. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are all meeting. I'm on Wiradjuri country. I'd like to pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging, and to extend that respect to other First Nations people. I celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal cultures and languages across Australia. My name is Amy Heap and I work for the Riverina Regional Library, and it is my pleasure to introduce Andrew Pippos, the author of Luckies. Andrew is a former journalist. He has a doctorate in creative writing and tutors at the University of Technology in Sydney. Luckies is his debut novel, and we were very excited when New South Wales Public Librarians chose it to be the very first New South Wales Reads. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you for having me. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and where I wrote my novel. I pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging.
So thank you. So Andrew, these are really strange times in so many ways. What has it been like to release a novel in a pandemic?
Well, I mean, it's been okay. You know, I'm sure that if we were living in normal times, then I would have, traveled to Melbourne and Brisbane and Wagga Wagga, I hope, and met booksellers and readers from all over the country. But it's been a good experience, despite the fact that we've been living in a pandemic. I've been very fortunate to receive letters and messages on social media from readers, people who have enjoyed the book or got something out of the book, and that's been an amazing experience. I've never had that experience before, and to read these messages every other day is really something, particularly when the process of writing a book is such a solitary thing, and you really do wonder what the world is going to make of the book when it's all finally said and done and out in the bookstores. So it's been a good experience. It's changed my life in many ways. I don't live in a castle now. I still have the same clothes, but it has changed my life in some ways. It's been good, and I'm grateful. I'm very grateful for my readers.
Oh, excellent. So Luckies is your very first novel, as I said. What has your journey towards this achievement been like? Have you always wanted to write fiction?
Always. It's been the most consistent sort of ambition of my life, and it's been a pursuit that's given my life a lot of meaning and structure in times when the rest of my life was chaos and full of uncertainty. And the process of Luckies was at times of sort of a strange, distressing experience when I had lost my way, and at times it was really magical. And some of the happiest moments of my life were spent working on this book, in the middle of the night, at my kitchen table where I sit now. So yes, it's very hard to compress the whole experience into a short answer. But look, that's a start.
Yeah, that's great. Now, writers are generally also readers. What types of things do you enjoy reading?
Look, I read poetry, short fiction, narrative, non-fiction. I don't mind some criticism and theory. And of course, I love novels. There are so many books that have been very important to me that I feel like whenever I get asked this question, I can just name different authors. An author I've been thinking about a lot recently is the Argentinian short story writer, Jorge Luis Borges. His story is, I don't think I write like him. I'm not a magical realist, although I'm not a social realist either. But when I read his stories for the first time at 18, it really blew my mind and changed my idea of what was possible in fiction, and that, libraries could be like the setting of a story, and that could be essential to, finding a book in a library could change a plot, could be the sort of climactic moment in a story. That was incredible for me as someone who had spent a lot of time in libraries, as I'm sure you have, Amy. And
Yes.
And yeah, so stories such as The Aleph and Tlon Akbar Orbis Tertius, I'm probably mispronouncing it, were incredible stories, and I recommend them to everyone.
Do you have a favorite book, or 5 if you can't narrow it down?
That's very difficult. Look, Great Expectations was a very important book in my youth, and I often say reel that one off. Jude the Obscure, Thomas, if you can stay in the 19th century, Jude the Obscure is an incredible book, and really probably the only book in which I cried when I read that at 16. There are scenes in Jude that are unforgettable. The scene when Jude reads the Latin Creed in the pub, or of course, Done Because We Are Too Many, I'm not misquoting. That scene, I won't go into detail, are just some of the greatest scenes in the 19th century novel. Flaubert's Sentimental Education, I read that as a 26 or 7-year-old bouncing around Glebe in Sydney, not sure what I was doing with my life, with never enough money. And, that book came along at the right time. The Charterhouse of Parma by Stendhal. That's a book that has had a lot of influence on my writing, and particularly on Lucky's. That sense of an adventure novel was, important to certain chapters of the novel, like the Benny Goodman chapters, for example.
I know you're very busy at the moment with work, but have you read any great books kind of in this pandemic period? Some people have read a lot, some people have not been able to read. How's it been for you?
My reading I haven't read as much in the pandemic. There was really a few reasons for that. I think that I was working on the proofs of Lucky's, and then when the book was published in late October, it really sort of took over my life in November and December. So I haven't read as much as I usually do. Excuse me. 2 books that come to mind, though, are The Adversary by Ronnie Scott. I know he blurbed my book, and it looks like I'm repaying him a favor by mentioning him. But that
Which is allowed.
No, I know that's allowed, but I don't want it to seem like that's all it is.
Yeah.
That is a wonderful book, and a funny book, and just a unnaturally smooth prose in that novel, and I got a real kick out of it. And Lives Other Than My Own by Emmanuel Carrère, a French author. That is a wonderful work of nonfiction that I recommend. And those, excellent. Yeah.
We'll be taking those down and sharing them in the chat later, so that people, if they're trying to write notes. Sorry, this is a personal one. Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights?
Look, it has to be Wuthering Heights. I'm not even going to think about that. Look, I read that book when I was probably 16 or 17, the same time that I read all those other Victorian novels. You can imagine what it's like being a teenage boy who plays football on weekends, lives in the suburbs, reading a book like Wuthering Heights and understanding what intense emotions are like. That is a life-changing novel, and it's not a pleasant book. I don't think it's not a book that you can say, "Oh, I really enjoyed that." But the same.
Well, the character's delightful.
The same is true of Dostoevsky and many other great writers that are essential. So no, Jane Eyre, no.
All righty. Well, now that we know where you stand on all the important issues, it's time to delve into talking about Lucky's. I do want to remind the audience that they can put their own questions and comments in the Q&A box. Now, when I was growing up in a suburb of Sydney, I had a Greek-owned cafe and a Greek-owned fish and chip shop just nearby. I used to buy lollies from Con's Milk Bar, 20-cent mixture, and Con would even let me buy cigarettes for my mother when I was a child, which probably says a lot about when I was growing up.
Okay, did you ever buy cigarettes? Did you buy cigarettes?
They weren't for me.
Okay.
So many of us in the city and the country have memories of Greek cafes and milk bars, but what is your experience of them?
Well, my experience was really a family experience. It was my grandmother and uncle ran a cafe in Riverina in New South Wales, and that's where we went in every school holidays and long weekends until I was 18. And so did many of my other cousins. And it was a sort of a hub for the extended family. It was my first experience of community, and it was like a setting that has fascinated me my whole life. You know, it was the typical setup with an Art Deco cafe at the front, and then rooms at the back, and a backyard with lemon trees and vines and a big olive tree. And, I loved going there. That's the Cafe Deluxe, it was called. It's no longer around, but it was like I said, a setting that fascinated me, the mixture of cultures, the people who would come into the shop, the stories that you would hear. And I always knew that there would be cafes in my first novel, But I didn't want the novel to be set entirely in a cafe. That was never really part of the plan. I wanted it to be a more expansive novel that was really set over the life span of the Greek Australian cafe in the 20th century. Yeah. And I wanted to write about worlds that intersected with the cafe world as well. So it really so I had a sense of what the structure would be like at the start of the writing process, but and I knew that the cafes would be at the heart of it. But it's not only a book about the cafe world. No. And I think that, the ancient Greek idea of a good story is that it takes place in one setting over a few days, and there's one protagonist, and the plot is a product of their tragic flaw. And certainly in Lucky's, there are characters with tragic flaws. And the plot does follow causation for the most part, really, and that begins in the Benny Goodman chapters and continues until the final chapters. But there are a few events, just a few, that are like bombs going off in the lives of characters. Yeah. The shooting in the 90s in the final cafe is the main kind of external event. And these kinds of events from a classical viewpoint are like the interventions of gods, of external forces. But I wanted those to be part of the novel, because life is like that, right? People live under dictatorships, their lives ruled by tyrants, and sort of look at where we are now, a pandemic. Where did this come from? Where do plagues come from? Not from a hero's tragic flaw. So yes, I was interested in worlds that collided with or were offshoots of the cafe world. And that could be captured within the full trajectory of the Greek Australian cafe. How these went from being everywhere, from being a part of everyone's childhood, almost everyone's childhood, to being a sort of lost world, and, to being a subject for historians and journalists and novelists now.
Yes. So earlier I was talking about people having either American-style food or a Greek feast to eat as they watch this evening. And food is a really important element in Lucky's. I think you definitely not only made us hungry, but made us long for proper Greek food. I loved how Achilles beat up a man while talking about Greek meatballs because he couldn't put them on the menu. Why did Greek cafes not serve more Greek food? And do you think we're doing better now?
I think we are doing better now. I think that at the time that the Greek cafes were established, in the early decades of the 20th century, Greeks were radically foreign, and Greek food was just not going to be accepted by mainstream Australia. So they had to find another way of making their businesses work, and American food was the option that they went for. And you had I know the historians have had a lot to say about this, and certainly my book isn't a work of social history, but you had the cafes and you had the milk bars and you had these innovations that in restaurant culture that were brought to Australia by the Greeks. And I think we are doing better now. I mean, there are still remnants of assimilation culture in multicultural Australia. There are still, this is not a perfect multicultural, but I believe that Australia is getting better.
Great. I know that you enjoy cooking. What Greek recipes would you urge us to make?
There are so many. I mean, look, there's nothing like a baked lamb, kleptiko. That's a wonderful. That takes you 6 hours, but that's just perfect. And then try to bake some pasta, perhaps right at the end in the juice from the kleptiko. That's a little Ithacan trick with a bit of feta and riganese. That's perfect. But savaro is really beautiful. Pasta saga. Those are dishes that are very much very popular in the Eptanizar, the western islands of Greece. And I would those were the dishes that I grew up eating, and I still cook them today. And you don't often find them on the menus of Greek restaurants in Australia, because too many restaurants in Greek restaurants in Australia have the same menu. But I would recommend trying regional food, including Eptanizan food.
That does sound delicious. Now, food is one way that we express culture and our connection to heritage. Lucky's has lots of references to Greek mythology. How important was it for you to link this sort of more recent Greek experience in Australia with the wealth of Greek culture?
That's a really complex question. And a lot of the characters, carry their Greek heritage in different ways. Achilles is quite tortured by it in many ways. Whereas towards the end of the book, you see Jamie, who doesn't have a Greek name. He's interested in pet snakes. Mm-hmm. He knows these details about the history of certain dishes. So they all carry their heritage in their own way. To me, look, personally, and this obviously comes out in the book, you've identified it very well, that as a child, the things that were really interesting to me about Greekness were Greek mythology and food. And then after that was really the story of Greece in the 20th century, the story of the occupation of Greece and the Civil War. Those were stories that I heard from relatives in the extended family, and they were fascinating, terrible, horrific stories, but they certainly captured my imagination.
I did the Instagram read along and live chat, and my colleague Monique was the one who mentioned the references to Greek mythology, and I confess to not being familiar with all that many of them. In recent years, I have read a couple of twists on Greek mythology, Circe by Madeline Miller and The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, but I am keen to know more. Do you have suggestions of what we should read if we're not that familiar with Greek mythology?
Well, if you're interested in reading ancient Greek literature, there's a play called Oedipus Rex by Sophocles that really is I think the crowning literary achievement of the classical era. And then after that, you don't have to go straight for Homer. The Iliad is an extremely violent book, and it's really not to everyone's taste. But Anne Carson's translations of Sappho are absolutely beautiful. And I mean, Sappho really was one of the greatest writers to ever live. And it's a great tragedy that so few of her poems are still around. They're all in fragments. But Anne Carson does a beautiful job in that book, which is called If Not Winter. I would just go straight for the ancients. There's still a lot there.
Yeah. Now, one of the reasons that Lucky's was chosen for New South Wales Reads is, what we've been talking about. It really reminds us of our own nostalgic experiences. But of course, as you've said, as well as being about the phenomenon of Greek-owned cafes in Australia, it's the story of a particular family and those around them. Achilles and Lucky are larger-than-life characters. Where did they come from? Do you know them?
Well, I think the seeds of each of these characters is really found in my family tree. It's true that Achilles to some extent does resemble my grandfather. And there are aspects of Lucky's personality that are a little like my father, but I really should say that only sort of minor traits, really. Certainly Lucky's energy is something that I took from my father, and that my father who died in that. See, it's very difficult to talk about writing a novel without it becoming a little bit personal, because you throw everything into it and it takes years and years and years. So I should say my father died during the writing of this book, and so I was thinking a lot about him and his life, and he did end up in Lucky in some ways. But I'm really just using a bit of their personalities, adding something else here, and very soon you have a character.
Lots of us read for setting, and Lucky's has such a great sense of place and time as well. Why did you choose these particular eras to set your story in?
It seemed really obvious to me that that it would be set in various eras during the lifespan of the Greek Australian Cafe. So I think there's a chapter in every other decade, really, from the 30s onwards. As for the setting, it's mostly set in Sydney. There are chapters in Chicago and London, in Greece. But Sydney is a city that is very interesting to me, and I always wanted to. I find it an inspiring place to. It's terrible in many ways, but it's also a very interesting city, and I love writing about it. I didn't grow up. Most of my childhood was not spent in Sydney. It was actually spent I was born in South Korea, in Seoul, and then much of my childhood was spent in Canberra. But I've spent most of my life in Sydney. So it's the home that I chose. And I chose it because it's infuriated me, and it's kind of almost broken me in my 20s, but it's never bored me.
That's great. Now, I really love a book with an interesting structure. Lucky's is set in, across several time periods and in several places. It's following characters who seem kind of unconnected at first, and then as you read it, the strands come together in surprising ways. How did this structure come about?
Well, fairly early on, I realized that it really wouldn't work as a chronological story, because it would be too Achilles heavy, and he's not the most important character in the book at all. So I knew that it would move back and forth, and that Emily should be introduced a little earlier than 2/3 of the way through the book. So I knew that I needed to have a scattered plot in the novel, and so that's what I did. And the risk with that is that causation that I mentioned earlier on would be obscured a little, and perhaps for some readers it is, but really there is a point where hopefully the reader sees that all these events are connected. One event has led to another event, has led to another event. Of course, with the interjection of these external forces, like Henry, like the shooter Henry, as I mentioned before. And then it became a bit of a jigsaw puzzle, really, like what variations in setting and mood and character were interesting to me was something that I had to play with really right up until 6 months before the book was printed.
That was my experience of it. Puzzle is how I put it. That it all just kind of comes together and they're separate parts, but at the end you see how it all connects. Which is clever and a really enjoyable reading experience. So Lucky's nickname is one with kind of happy connotations. Everyone wants to be lucky, but it was given to him for a negative reason. And I think some of the characters, Achilles and Ian, for example, really struggle with seeing the consequences of their behaviour as bad luck. Can you tell us a bit about this theme of luck versus making your own destiny?
Luck to me is really, luck in this novel is not really the dominant sort of theme. It plays itself out in a number of ways. Certainly he gets his nickname. It's just a nasty nickname that sticks. It really isn't that crucial. But that's how nicknames are. They're often just these ridiculous things that people carry throughout their lives, like a burden. I mean, one of his tragic flaws, if we get back to this ancient Greek idea of what makes a story good, is that he has a problem with gambling, and he thinks that through his gambling, through the luck of the roll of dice or the draw of cards, that he can make up for things that have gone wrong in his life. And this is not how life works. And it's difficult for him to see that's never going to work. And of course, at the end of the book, what he finds is that his sort of, he's out of luck, so to speak. He's done all he can in his career. That's over. But what he's full of is love, and he finds what he wants, really. All this gambling, all this, this sort of crazy attempt to restart the restaurant, restart a restaurant. It's all about reestablishing the relationships that he didn't have, essentially with Sophia and with Jamie. And of course, we're allowed to do spoilers in this.
Yes, we are.
Yeah. So of course he finds that at the end, and he begins a new relationship with them, and this is a promising relationship. And the novel doesn't say what happens next, but it gestures towards the fact that in the future, the characters in this room at the end of the novel, they will be sharing their lives with each other in the years to come.
Yeah. Now, another great theme that I found in the book is that of imposters. We obviously have two characters who consciously pose as someone that they're not, to varying effect. And then we have Emily, who often feels like a fraud, which really reminded me of how, imposter syndrome or phenomenon is a thing that you hear a fair bit about these days. It is a reasonably recent thing. Why do you think that is so common to many of us?
It's a very good question. I think it comes from just a lack of confidence, a belief that we're not good enough, or we don't deserve the things that we do have. or that we need to have more in order to be happy or good. We live in a culture that preys on these emotions, advertising, media, we're constantly being told that we're constantly being assessed in our work. We're constantly assessing people who give us rides to the pub or to a friend's house, where we're constantly being told we're not good enough, that we're just 2 stars or 3 stars or 4 stars or 4.5 stars. But I think that this is leading to, this has always been part of life, but I think there are certainly powerful forces, like particularly advertising, that really prey on our lack of confidence. So maybe that's got something to do with it. I really don't know. But and then there's so many ways of answering this question, but certainly if you're a novelist and you set out to write a novel, and I certainly felt this myself, that I felt that the job was just beyond me, that I was just never going to finish this thing, let alone produce something that would ever be published. So, I felt like an imposter in the early stages of drafting this book. And part of my emotional sort of experience of writing this book is feeling less and less like an imposter, and more like a person who's writing a novel, like a novelist.
Yeah, but I think that element of Emily was definitely one thing that people really related to, and you were really drawn to her because of that. And she had so much to overcome in her life, the impact of having witnessed her father's suicide, her career frustrations, and her marriage problems. I think it's very clever the way you set her a personal mystery within the greater story of Lucky's that she came to report on. Can you tell us a bit about how you developed Emily's story, and whether there's something about Australia that is conducive to new beginnings?
I think I think any new place is conducive to new beginnings. But obviously in Australia there are issues with seeing it as a new world. Framing it in that colonial frame is a very risky one, and that's one I can't really speak to. But why is Emily part of the story is a good question, but it most certainly has an answer. She's the missing part of the story of Lucky's franchise. Nobody really knows about it's not very well known how Lucky came into this money, what Ian's role was, what really happened. But Emily is sort of carrying the legacy of that. And so I bring her into the story.
Yeah, it was very, very well done, and an enjoyable kind of mystery for us to go along with. Did you have to watch a lot of Wheel of Fortune or get a pet snake as part of your research?
Okay, so I did watch a lot of Wheel of Fortune as a child, so there wasn't a lot. I only watched 1 or 2 episodes, and the game has changed so much, and it's become very elaborate that I really had to. The Wheel of Fortune in this novel is a stripped down, simplified version of Wheel of Fortune. So that's that. As for the snakes, well, I've never had a pet snake, so I did have to take some advice on things like what pet snakes eat and with their behavior and so on, and how they even, the way they move. But I will say that if there are mistakes in the novel about keeping a pet snake, then that's not the fault of the people whose advice I sought. That's on me.
Because we did get a pet snake.
Why do people have pet snakes anyway? I don't know. So
we got one during lockdown.
Okay.
I wasn't on board at the time, but I have come around.
Okay. What does the pet snake eat? Can I ask that?
Yeah, he eats little rats, and their names are things like Fuzzies and Hoppers, like you said. But I would never, ever set him loose in the house.
Okay. Okay.
So in the Instagram read along, we talked about how Lucky's would make a great movie or television series. Would you be keen to see that happen? And if it did, do you have ideas for a Dreamcast?
That would be nice if it happened, but look, it's not really something I think about. As for the cast, I don't know.
You would, of course, need multiple actors for roles that we follow for too long.
Yeah, I don't know. Who would be good? Maybe, I think Leonardo would be good as Lucky. Let's just think big here. He's Mexican. He could,
this guy.
Yeah, we could just dye his hair and that would be fine. Maybe Alex Dimitriades as Achilles, that would be great. Valia, I don't know. The actress who read for the audiobook Artemis Ioannidis would be great for Valia, actually. After that, I don't know, Emily Blunt, maybe, just because I really like Emily Blunt and they have the same name. So yeah. And then after that, I don't know. I'm just making this up on the spot. This is actually not something that I've thought about. I promise. People are never going to believe that, though.
Well, you'll have to think from here on in. And if anybody in the audience has ideas, feel free to put them in the Q&A. There's a really insightful passage in the book about aging. It's when Lucky's getting ready to go on the Wheel of Fortune, and he notes that he's kind of gone past the stage where a stubble and beard and long curls suggest music and classical statues, and instead signal self-neglect and delusion. Now, clearly you are a long way from that stage. I was just wondering where you came across this insight.
Well, at times I do feel a bit old, and I think, like anyone, I look in the mirror and I see that the time is passing, and there are days when I really just don't even bother looking in the mirror at all. So it's really just the work of a novelist is really just taking your emotions and then expanding them, and of course observing how other people feel about aging too. So
yes, struck a note with me. So the detective from the 3rd of April tells Emily that Lucky is Don Quixote. How much of what happens to Lucky is a result of his unrealistic idealism? And is that really a bad thing?
No, I don't think it is a bad thing. I think that there's an element of Quixote to his personality, really from the Benny Goodman moment onwards. Perhaps even in his desire to be a musician, in a town where big band music was huge and it was extremely competitive. I think that I don't think it is a ridiculous thing to be a Don Quixote. You need to have dreams, and reality is cruel, and you can't let reality change what you want so much. Like yeah, I don't.
That's great. Everyone reads a book in their own way, and they're affected by their life experiences, their worldviews, their personalities. And once a book is set in flight, the author doesn't really have much influence on how it affects people anymore. I'm wondering what your hopes were for Lucky's when you set it free.
Well, I didn't really have a lot of expectations. I was terrified, curious. I had no idea what was about to happen. And what happened is really I mean, it is really shocking when you spend, you know, so much time on a story and everything is intentional and has a purpose, and then people have their own readings into it, and that is amazing. And you know, a book is not every book is for every reader, and of course there are people who aren't going to enjoy this book, but you know, you publish a book, you write a book for people who are going to like it or get something out of it. And so I've heard amazing interpretations on the book, and it's certainly not for me to say, you know, to correct those interpretations or to set them straight or to respond to critics, or that's not what being an author is about at all. And you know, I've heard some people have responded to the Emily character very strongly, others to Lucky. I've had letters from people who said that Ian was their favorite character, that Achilles was their favorite character, that it reminded them of their experiences in the media or with Greek fish and chip shops. And it is strange to hear all the ways that the book sets, the way that the book affects people's imaginations. It'll never stop surprising me. It really won't.
Well, we're almost ready to start taking questions from the audience. So if you are watching and you have either a question or a comment from Andrew, please pop those in the Q&A. So Andrew, what can we expect next from you? Where can we see you next? What will we read from you next?
I think my next public event will be at the Adelaide Writers Festival. So I'm very excited about that. My next book, I don't want to say too much about it. There are aspects of the book that I haven't fully worked out, but it will be a work of nonfiction, and it will be published by Picador Pan Macmillan.
Excellent. Well, we should
sorry for being secretive.
No, you're not alone. We can't expect too many spoilers. Right, so let's see what some people in the audience are asking. So Anna is interested in the male characters and their harshness, brutality, and seemingly little understanding of females. It's not so much a question as a comment, something she would clearly like you to talk a little bit about.
Well, the character that is perhaps the worst in this respect is Achilles. And really what we have with him is a type of masculinity that is very old-fashioned and really has run its course. And I mean, he's a victim of this, and he makes the people around him, he victimizes the people around him as well. So that was something that I wanted to explore. And you know, he's an Ithacan, and there was the Ithacans of his generation and older were, you know, there were macho men who fought with knives, and dueling was common, vendettas were common. So it's that machismo culture is what I was writing about. And you can still see remnants of it today, of course. It's not something that ended in the late 19th century and on Greek islands. It's something that's still around and still causes enormous problems.
But certainly makes for interesting reading and very thought-provoking. Somebody has asked for you to say again the name of the cafe you used to go to in Sydney, but I think that perhaps is the one in Riverina.
Yes, the Cafe Deluxe.
Yeah, so that's the Cafe Deluxe. And Fatima has asked a question about being a writer. If you are a starting author, how do you go about finalising your notes? How do you find a publisher? And how much does it cost initially?
Well, it doesn't really doesn't really cost you anything beyond having a laptop, having a printer, and the cost is really in your time. You're spending hours and hours a week working on this book, and you're making sacrifices in terms of holidays, or sometimes you might need to work part-time in order to finish the novel. So that is the cost. And you have to love it in order to be able to pay that cost. And you don't want the people around you to pay for that as well. You need to be, you need to have supportive people around you, and so on. As for publishing, you really need to work on the manuscript as much as you can, and revise it until you can't revise it anymore. Ask a friend to read it, and then you start sending it out to agents or to publishers or to contests. There are many ways. Many ways to a publisher's doorstep, but for me, it was an agent.
Those are good tips. Mel has said, it's nice to hear that you've been so touched by letters from your readers. I've never thought to write to a novelist I've enjoyed. Would you encourage more people to do that?
Yes, you should. Because it will be received well. It's not like, oh yeah, of course. Of course. You don't publish a book and expect people to throw flowers at you everywhere you go. The book doesn't work without readers. It's just a pile of paper. Otherwise, and it's such a solitary pursuit, and there are very few author events going on. So do write to that author and tell them that you liked their book and what you liked about it. It will be gratefully received. You can just imagine these novelists sort of locked up in their room for 4 or 5 years working on this thing, and they don't know if it will work or if anyone will read it, and if people do read it, whether they like it. So to hear from a reader who has enjoyed a book it's not something that I take for granted. And I often wonder if my responses to those readers, which are really just thank you. And I'm so glad that you wrote, and I appreciate that you got in touch. I just wonder if that's just doesn't fully express how grateful I am to get to receive those messages. So if anyone sent me a message and you're on Zoom right now, thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Oh, that's really great. That's a great encouragement. I don't think of doing it myself.
When I was about 19, I sent a letter to I've sent very few of them myself, but when I was 19, I sent a letter to Helen Garner, an author I really loved at the time and still love, and she wrote back.
Yeah. So, and you still remember it.
I still remember it.
Someone else has asked whether you read in languages other than English, because you mentioned quite a few French writers, for example.
I don't read. No, I don't really. I would love to read. I would love to read in French and German and ancient Greek, and sometimes I read modern Greek poets and I try to translate the poem. But that's really just me attempting to improve my Greek, which is pretty terrible.
Wow. At least you're giving it a go. It's better than my everything.
I'm the Quixote of Greek poetry translation.
Marion has said, hi, Andrew, you mentioned your next book will be non-fiction. How are you finding this new writing process compared to writing Lucky's?
It's easier in some ways and more difficult in other ways. It's easier in the sense that it seems to be coming together a lot faster than Lucky's did. But it's harder in that I'm thinking a lot about, and perhaps this is really unproductive, but I'm thinking a lot about what people will think of this book when it's finished. And I have a Zoom group with 2 other writers who are working on their second book as well. It's like a therapy session for me at the moment. I'm like, what are they going to say? And is this book going to upset people? And So all these, it's difficult conceptually, but in terms of putting words on the page, it's coming along. So if my publisher's on this Zoom as well, it's coming along. It's all right.
You're on track.
Yeah, and I'm sort of in therapy for it with this.
Nanette says that she loved the books, thanks. And she wants to know if the book has been released in Greece and how you think it will be or has been received there.
It hasn't been released in Greece. No, there was a feature article in the Weekend magazine of a large Athenian newspaper back in December, I think it was, Tovima, the Herald, and but that's the extent of its introduction. Yeah.
How do you think Greek people would react or respond to it?
I think that the story of the Greek Australian cafes is not as well known in Greece as it is here. I think it would be surprising, but I think that Greek people are, perhaps I'm taking liberties here, but I think the Greek people are increasingly interested in the diaspora.
Another person has said that they attended the talk last week, which was about Greek Australian milk bars and cafes with Leonard Janishevsky. And this person would like to know whether you've read that book.
I have read that book, and there's a picture of two of my uncles, my aunt and my father in that book. Yes, I have read it. It's essential reading.
It is, and all your libraries will have it, plus they have a website that you can buy it from. Sylvia would like to know approximately how long was Lucky's gestation period?
Well, it was a long time. I wish I could say that it took me 6 months, and then no, it took me about 8 years, and but a lot happened in that time. My father died, and there were all sorts of family upheavals, and I changed jobs, and I wrote a PhD, and I had a child. So that was a busy 8 years, and the novel happened in between all these life-changing events.
You have to fit your writing into all the spare moments until you can make it your full-time job.
That's right.
We have one last question, which is from somebody who has written a few short stories for school children, picture books. Do you recommend they start with going to schools to give free copies, or what else you would suggest to get those out there?
Oh, I really don't. That's a part of publishing that I don't know much about, but I do know that a lot of authors who write for children have enormous success with school visits, and so I think you should perhaps ask those authors how they get those gigs and how they found it.
Excellent. Well, that brings us to the end of all our questions. Thank you so much, Andrew, for being with us this evening and for sharing Lucky's moving story of culture and hope and redemption. And I'd like to thank everyone in the audience for coming along and for joining us for New South Wales Reads. And we hope to see you at more of our events in the future. Thank you, everybody. You can find us on YouTube. Have a great night.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everyone.